So it is easy to drift into a discussion about the freedom of art when talking about financing and the conditions under which art is created and produced. Instead, perhaps, we ought to think in terms of room to maneuver, what we can do, where, and at what time. A consideration that cannot be dissociated from the nation and nationality debate, nor indeed from these structural upheavals for funding. Something has changed. At the same time, independent economic activity has become more common, as it has in other fields, and freestanding initiatives have flourished rapidly. Many of these are part of a wave of what I would call strategic separatism. One defends one's self-determination and seeks to maintain a seeming distance from official structures and their often well-meaning inclination attributable to the goodwill of the welfare state, when it comes to the Nordic region, I think, to ingest anything independent, to sort of suck up independent initiatives, and I think this is particularly pronounced in a Swedish context, which has put out quite a few self-driven initiatives. So how can we think things differently? How can we think formats and protocols, methods and procedures differently, perhaps with the aim of creating more space to maneuver? One example that I find interesting, oh, here is some more from the UAE pavilion. One of the interesting case studies of the recent decade is Anton Vidokle's E-Flux, which is based in New York. He, as an artist, has turned an exhibition into a school, a panel discussion was transformed into a trial, and an information service became a publisher. The product, or effect, if we talk to Foucault again, of Vidokle's projects all point to this, that things can be different, they can be thought differently. Things being otherwise even appears as a trademark somehow of his, but instead of entering pre-existing institutions and other structures like many curators did in the 90s in Europe, he has gone in a different direction, and he is of course an artist, not a curator, one which appears as typical of the noughties, of the 00s, marked by the resurgence of self-organized initiatives and methods of collaboration, often with artists who in turn collaborate with many other categories of people who set up their own structures. They tend to seek self-determination, and they are busy carving out space for maneuvering in a cultural and political climate where various forms of instrumentalization abound. But let's turn for a moment to the beginnings. In 1998, two artists and a curator organized a one-night exhibition in a hotel room in Chinatown in New York. To avoid trouble, the hotel was given the impression that an audition was taking place, and towards the end of the night, some hotel employees even came to try their luck at the audition. Being broke, the organizer could not afford to print invites or even to post press releases. Instead, they announced the project to friends and colleagues via one of the artists, Anton Vidokle's brand new email account. That evening, many people came to see work by Michel Oder, Karsten Nicolai, Peter Scott, and Tomoko Takahashi, as you can see here. In this unspectacular and incidental way, the embryo of E-Flux, one of the simplest and yet most influential contributions to the arts infrastructure of recent decades, was born. Shortly after the exhibition in Chinatown, a company called E-Flux was formed with the artists Vidokle, Terence Gower, Josh Welber, and Adriana Arenas. Today, the company is owned and run by Vidokle and Julieta Aranda, who's also an artist. Then as now, art institutions, both public and private, could purchase access to a global network of receivers who, through an act of active subscription, receive announcements, as they call them. eFlux still offers rates lower than ads in established art magazines, and they keep on providing more facts than names, titles, and contacts. The eFlux announcements pride themselves of having a little more meat on their bones, albeit not more than a classical press release. On its website, eFlux is nowadays described as a news digest, and it has 2 additional branches, Art Agenda and Art and Education. Through eFlux's 3 announcements per day, we find out about exhibition openings, museum inaugurations, call for entries, ads for jobs, and many other things. No matter what goes on in the world, regardless of where we are, these things trickle into our mailboxes. And there is indeed a threshold for entries. Not all institutions and organizations can afford the announcements. Yet, being at the receiving end continues to be open to all and kostenlos, it's free. Although the 3 daily announcements can in no way be thought of as representative of the full range of activities in the world of contemporary art, I think they give a good coverage of certain things. Excuse me again. With eFlux, the New York-based artists crafted a service which has affected how we learn about contemporary art and how we deal with this information. At one and the same time, eFlux is a new format and a new infrastructure. In fact, eFlux could be thought of as something as rare as an invention, just like the art magazine and the biennial once were inventions in terms of what was distributed and displayed and how this was being done. Similar to how containers and pallets profoundly changed the infrastructure and logistics for transportation of goods in the 50s. In doing so, eFlux also gave the press release, one of the stalest and most boring PR formats within art, a new lease on life. Since its founding in 1999, eFlux has expanded its scope of activities beyond reaching 50,000 subscribers daily to include publishing of both books and most recently a journal. Here you see one of the magazines being announced, and here are very simply printed copies of the journal. Artist-centered projects such as the eFlux video rental, which you can see here, and Martha Rosler Library have been organized through eFlux and funded by eFlux. eFlux is now occupying its 2nd storefront space on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, where exhibitions, discussions, and other projects take place. And all this is possible because eFlux is a profit-making enterprise, a feature which distinguishes it from most artist-run spaces. eFlux has essentially become a financially independent structure controlled by artists, nowadays with a small number of employees. Within the parts of the art world which think of themselves as critical, this has been a point of contention. For some, this means too much complicity with capitalism, which discredits the activities. But one way of understanding the eFlux endeavor, beyond the invention, is as a quintessentially contemporary institution. It is an immaterial service which is dealing with global circulation of information about art activities, and thus it is embedded within the creative industries as well as in post-Fordist conditions of production. Furthermore, the more event-like side of the art world is well represented at eFlux, which thereby gives visibility to the very work of post-Fordism. If today's role model for the artist is the entrepreneur, the opposite is also true. The entrepreneurial is valued in most jobs, and the characteristics of the traditional artists as flexible, inventive, and eternally creative are lurking in most descriptions as well. So there is a sense of, if one can say, wholeness in Vidocle's work of entities. And Iflux is one of several projects which he has initiated, which can be framed as institution building. It shares certain features with other long-term artist projects, because this is an important feature of Iflux, that it's long-term. And it can be compared to Rick Lowe's project Row Houses in Houston, Rick Virtir and Kamin Lerchai Praset's The Land Foundation in the north of Thailand, in Chiang Mai, and 16 Beaver in New York, but also Konsthall C in Stockholm, which I will speak briefly about at the very end. A majority of these examples are self-sustained, and this is important. They are self-sustained. They operate from a particular locality, and they are indebted to site specificity and context sensitivity as phenomena. In a way, the strategy of those initiators can be thought of alongside what a state, a foundation, or a wealthy patron would do, which is to take, in this case, self-appointed responsibility for setting up an organization involving a considerable amount of people with some sense of stability and continuity. It is indeed about institution building, but more in relation to a local context and a specific community, whether geographical, social, cultural, or other. We can even speak about certain constituencies here, to borrow a term from politics. However, in the case of Iflux, and this is to do with global conditions certainly, the constituency is radically dispersed, and the office and project space could potentially be located in many other places. So we can think of these institution builders as a fifth form of institutional critique. And just to give you a very brief sketch of what the previous forms of institutional critique could be. The first generation, the first wave, the first form of institutional critique, if we do the quick, catchy version of history writing, is of course artists like Hans Hacke and Michael Asher, who from the late 60s onwards identified problems with existing institutions, and they criticized those from an outside position. A second form arose more or less in the 80s, and artists who are often named in this context are people like Fred Wilson and Andrea Fraser. They also looked for and identified dilemmas, problems, issues to be discussed within institutions, but they entered the institutions themselves. So they made work within an institution with a collection, like with Fred Wilson at the Maryland Historical Society in Baltimore, where he famously rearranged its collection of artifacts in such a way that, for instance, slave shackles for the first time were brought up from storage and put next to silverware in the metal display case. Or Andrea Fraser, who took on the guided tour format in many of her works. A third form of institutional critique is what I would call a constructive form of institutional critique, where artists like Rick Virtir, who's been mentioned a few times today, or Apollonia Šuštešić, whose light therapy you can see on this image, enter the institution, also identify a problem, but maybe suggesting a possible solution, or at least proposing other ways of working to get away from what is the main problem. And this is also the case, I think, with many of the projects by Bick Vanderpoel. This is their bookshop piece from Boijmans van Beuningen, the museum in Rotterdam in 1996, where the city of Rotterdam at the time did not have a good bookshop for art and culture and theory. And the artists copied ICA's bookshop in London one-to-one architecturally and also in terms of its contents, and put it in one of the empty spaces of the Boijmans van Beuningen Museum, both to provide a resource for the local art community and to comment on the situation that the museum recently had opened a very commercial museum store in a front space facing the street, whereas this room was really at the back of the museum, and all the books, etc., were for sale. A fourth wave could be thought of in terms of artists who look at and want to criticize the art system as a whole, and doing this from the inside, like the third version. And I'm thinking of people like Marion van Osten, who I think is one of the first people who has really brought up issues of the creative industries on the agenda. This is an image from the project Atelier Europa, Studio Europe, which she and a number of other artists and cultural practitioners did at the Kunstverein in Munich in 2004, and which looked precisely at post-Fordism and the creative imperative that not only artists are living with these days, but most workers within information society have to be involved with somehow. We can also think of Carrie Young, who looks at art often from a business perspective, and she's borrowing strategies from the business world and for selling, etc., in order to ask questions about actually how the art industry is becoming more and more commercialized and a part of something that is looking like a business culture. So let me now go ahead. So with Anton Vidokles, his institution building, the United Nations Plaza that he ran in Berlin for a number of years in this former supermarket building in the eastern parts of Berlin with seminars, etc. They also did a radio station there. You can see the artist with headphones, and incidentally, Fia Backström on the left. I mentioned the Nordic Pavilion in Venice. She will be one of the 2 Swedish artists who are there in June of next year. Julieta Aranda. Night School, another project that Anton Vidokle organized at the New Museum as part of their educational department program of the last couple of years, which was monthly, weekend-long seminars with different artists and other cultural practitioners that in many ways has raised the discussion about educational departments and what they can and cannot do in institutions. So, there are also, as you can imagine, examples in the Nordic region, and the one that I will bring up as a case study is Konsthall in Hökarängen. Konsthall was started in 2004 by the artist Per Hasselberg, and Hökarängen is a suburb about 15 minutes by subway south of the city center of Stockholm. It was built from the late 40s until the late 50s, and it was sort of an experimental area in terms of late modernist architecture and urban planning. It was really integrated in a program of building society about utopia and about neighborhoods and democracy. And this project that Per Hasselberg, the artist, has started takes this context as a starting point. So what is happening within this institution is a form of contextual curating, where the place, its legacy, its potential futures, etc., are thematized in a number of different ways. I'm just going to show you a few slides of what this suburban little center looks like. This is from the 80s. One of the things that Hökarängen is known for is that it had the first pedestrian street in Sweden at the very center of its structure. This is what it looks like today when you walk from the subway. Maybe they should think about other promotional images on their website It looks pretty gloomy, but I can tell you that it's really lovely. At the back, you can see the building. It's from 1949, designed by David Heldén, a very interesting architect of the time, who has also designed the Stockholm University and parts of the city center around Sergels torg. And this is the entrance, and this is what the exhibition space sometimes look like. It occupies one half of a large communal laundry room. At this point in history, it was quite common to have very big laundry rooms, and this one was active until just before Per Hasselberg started Konsthall, and on the right-hand side, it's still in place. But on the left-hand side, you have all kinds of activities, including exhibitions, and sometimes the glass wall is blocked, so you cannot see, but you can often smell detergent. This is Emily Royston's exhibition earlier this fall. And Konsthall is in many ways a institution, like we know an institution, not dissimilar from what I described about Anton Vidokle's projects. It's artist initiated, so it functions as an institution, as an artist project, but also as an urban renewal project on the local level. So an important stakeholder here is the local business community. So you should visit their website and read about how they operate, because it's quite an unusual strategy in terms of how you can engage the locals, both politicians, civil servants, the business community, etc. And this initiative, together with several others, one could mention also within a Nordic context, Copenhagen Free University that Annette talked about earlier today. It's about artists who take a step sideways and initiate new entities. We know this from artist-run spaces, of course, but I think this is different. And it's also different, I think, from these earlier forms of institutional critique, because this one is less direct. And it also seems to not be wanting to be directly alternative, but rather parallel. And this brings me to Peter Schjeldahl, the New York critic at the Village Voice, who 10 years ago wrote an article about exactly what is alternative anyway, that perhaps we should not stick too much to that term, but to think about parallelities, about structure that exist at the same time. And his point was that if we think about alternatives, maybe there is too much oppositionality, but on the other hand, if it is true that we're burdened by consensus culture, it could also be a point in using that. Since the mid-90s, self-organization is, again, a force to reckon with, like the recent return of institutional critique. And they should both be seen in light of the effects of neoliberal economy on democracy. It's a warning of sorts, a call to arms. However, the withdrawal from the mainstream, which we can observe within this fifth form of institutional critique, these institution builders, is not celebrating separation as a virtue in and of itself, but as a necessity for survival. And I think we could call it strategic separatism. It's about side streams next to the mainstream. Some of those implicated within strategic separatism opt for less visibility, the opacicists. Others remain on the side but stay visible and accessible. We could term them the semi-visible. Both deviate from the classical Enlightenment paradigm of critique as being based on and striving for transparency. Interestingly enough, this trope of flight and escape has its equivalence in contemporary philosophy and political theory, with Foucault, to evoke him again, and his emancipatory, and I quote him, non-escapist terms of escape as a prime example. So, I'm finishing by saying that rather than talking about alternatives and the freedom of art, this kind of artistic practice tends to build parallel spaces to maneuver. They enact a kind of strategic separatism in order to guarantee a certain degree of self-determination, a reasonable degree of self-determination, albeit sometimes temporarily, but quite often they have managed to do it over an extended period of time, which seems to be contrasting with many of the self-organized initiatives that were being referred to earlier today, in a culture which is ever more affected by instrumentalization by formalized powers. Thank you.